In 1829, a farmer's plow broke through the earth near the Delaware-Maryland border, revealing a wooden chest that would expose America's most chilling secret. Inside lay human bones, yellowed with age, skull cracked from violence. This wasn't just murder. This was the discovery that would unravel a criminal empire run by a woman whose name had become whispered terror across the region. For nearly 20 years, Martha "Patty" Cannon had operated what historians call the reverse Underground Railroad, not freeing slaves, but hunting free black Americans and selling them into bondage. But kidnapping was just the beginning. Cannon was also a serial killer who murdered anyone who threatened her empire of human suffering. The bodies they found were just the start. Over the following weeks, authorities would uncover at least 7 corpses on her property, including 3 children, all victims of a woman who had turned the promise of freedom into a death sentence. Before we descend deeper into this abyss of American evil, I need to know where you're hearing this from. What state or city are you in? Cannon's network stretched from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta, and her reach of terror touched communities everywhere. Drop a comment below and let me know your location. And if you're ready to learn the darkest truths they don't teach in history class, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to discover will change how you see everything you thought you knew about this country's past. The area where Patty Cannon built her empire was perfectly designed for evil to flourish. In the early 1800s, this remote region sat at the intersection of 3 jurisdictions: Sussex County, Delaware, Caroline County, Maryland, and Dorchester County, Maryland. This wasn't coincidence, this was strategic brilliance. Criminals could literally step across invisible lines to escape pursuing lawmen, like walking between different worlds where different rules applied. The locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, named after the tavern that would become headquarters for the most sophisticated kidnapping operation in American history. But here's what they don't want you to understand about how real evil operates. It doesn't announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It hides behind ordinary facades in plain sight, protected by the very systems meant to stop it. The landscape itself seemed designed by dark forces for concealment. Dense forests of pine and oak stretched for miles, broken only by marshy lands where screams would be swallowed by the wilderness. The Nanticoke River wound through like a serpent, providing waterways to transport human cargo under cover of darkness. Roads were nothing more than cart paths, and substantial towns were days away by horseback. For someone seeking to operate outside God's law and man's justice, this was paradise. This is your first lesson in understanding how true power works. Geography is destiny, and those who control the borderlands control the flow of everything forbidden. Martha Cannon arrived in this borderland around 1790, but her origins were deliberately shrouded in mystery. Court records suggest she was born around 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she kept her past as hidden as her future crimes. Some accounts place her birth in Canada, with immigration to Delaware at 16. What we know for certain is that she married Jesse Cannon, a local farmer who owned property straddling the state line. Together they had at least 1 daughter and lived what appeared to be an unremarkable rural life. But appearance, as you'll learn, is the greatest weapon of those who traffic in human misery. Jesse Cannon was described by neighbors as a quiet man who kept himself, working his modest farm and raising tobacco like dozens of other settlers. The Cannon homestead sat on a plot that straddled the Delaware-Maryland border, a detail that would prove crucial to Patty's criminal empire. The house was a simple 2-story structure with thick wooden walls and small windows looking like any other frontier home. What neighbors couldn't see were the secret rooms and hidden spaces being constructed beneath their feet, designed to conceal kidnapped human beings. This is how evil embeds itself in society, not through obvious monstrosity, but through careful camouflage among the decent and unsuspecting. Patty Cannon understood something that most criminals never grasp. The perfect criminal doesn't look like a criminal at all. Beneath this veneer of normalcy lay something far darker, and it was connected to forces reshaping America itself. The early 1800s marked a crucial transformation in the economics of human bondage. When Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808, they thought they were striking a blow against slavery. Instead, they created a domestic market that made human trafficking more profitable than ever before. A healthy adult slave who might have cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $1,000 in the Deep South. This price surge created powerful incentives for those willing to traffic in human misery. But here's what they don't teach you in school. This wasn't just economics. This was the creation of a system where American citizens could be hunted like animals by their own countrymen. The cotton gin had transformed the South into a machine that devoured human lives, and the expanding plantations of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia needed bodies to feed that machine. The legal ban on importing slaves from Africa meant only one source remained: the domestic population, either through natural increase or through the capture and re-enslavement of free black Americans. The Delmarva Peninsula was particularly vulnerable to these predators. Following the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people had gained freedom through gradual emancipation laws or individual acts of manumission. Maryland and Delaware had substantial populations of free black Americans working as laborers, artisans, and small farmers. These communities lived in constant terror, knowing they had no powerful protectors, and their disappearances often went uninvestigated by authorities who viewed them as less than fully human. The legal status of free black Americans in the early 1800s was a carefully constructed trap designed to make them vulnerable to predators like Patty Cannon. While they weren't enslaved, they possessed virtually none of the rights enjoyed by white citizens. They couldn't vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in most courts. Their freedom could be challenged at any time, and they were required to carry papers proving their status, papers that could easily be destroyed or stolen. For criminals like Cannon, these legal vulnerabilities weren't obstacles. They were opportunities. This is your second lesson in understanding how power really operates. The law isn't a shield for the innocent. It's a weapon for those who know how to wield it. Into this environment stepped Patty Cannon, proving that evil recognizes no gender boundaries. Contemporary accounts describe her as a large, physically imposing woman with unusual strength. She stood nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women barely reached 5 feet, and she possessed what neighbors described as an intimidating presence that could silence a room. Her voice was reportedly deep and commanding, and she had a reputation for violent outbursts when crossed, but it was her mind, not her body, that made her truly dangerous. Her husband Jesse died under mysterious circumstances around 1826. He claimed she poisoned him, leaving her a widow with complete control over the family property and operations. By this time, she had already begun forming the criminal connections that would make her name synonymous with terror across the region. The transformation of Patty Cannon from frontier widow to criminal mastermind began with her daughter's marriages, unions that would define the next 2 decades of horror. Both of her daughter's husbands were slave kidnappers, and this wasn't coincidence. This was dynastic planning, the careful construction of a criminal empire through blood and marriage ties. Her daughter's first husband, Henry Brereton, was a blacksmith who supplemented his income by capturing free black Americans for sale in the South. In 1811, Brereton was arrested and imprisoned in Georgetown, Delaware for kidnapping, but he managed to escape from jail that same year. This escape wasn't luck. It was the first sign of the corruption that would protect the Cannon family for decades. Brereton's criminal activities had been well known long before his arrest. As a blacksmith, he had legitimate reasons to travel throughout the region, visiting farms and settlements to shoe horses and repair tools. This mobility provided perfect cover for his illegal activities, allowing him to identify potential victims during legitimate business calls. He would note which families had teenage children or young adults who might bring high prices in southern slave markets. The methods employed by early kidnappers like Brereton were crude but devastatingly effective. They relied on deception, overwhelming force, and the isolated nature of rural life. A common technique involved approaching free black families with offers of employment in distant locations. Parents desperate for economic opportunities would sometimes allow their children to travel with these supposed employers, only to discover too late that they had signed their children's death warrants. This is how evil spreads. not through drama, tick announcements, but through the exploitation of hope and desperation. It was after Brereton's escape that the first documented murder connected to the Cannon family occurred, marking their evolution from simple kidnappers to cold-blooded killers. Brereton, working with Patty Cannon and another criminal named Joseph Griffith, ambushed a slave trader known only as Rigel at Cannon's Tavern. The plan was brutal in its simplicity: get the victim drunk, rob him of his money and slaves, then eliminate the only witness. Court records show that Rigel was shot and killed during the robbery. Brereton and Griffith were eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813, but Patty Cannon escaped prosecution entirely. This was your first glimpse into how the system really works. Justice isn't blind, it's selective. The Rigel murder marked a significant escalation in criminal activities centered around the Cannon property. Prior to this incident, the family had been involved primarily in facilitating kidnappings and providing safe haven for criminals. The willingness to commit murder for profit demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that would characterize all of Cannon's future operations. Contemporary newspaper accounts provide disturbing details about the crime. Rigel had been traveling with substantial money, estimates suggest between $3,000 and $5,000, intended for purchasing enslaved people in local markets. He stopped at what he believed was a legitimate tavern for food and lodging, unaware he was walking into a carefully laid trap. The conspirators plied him with alcohol throughout the evening, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Rigel finally retired to his room, Brereton and Griffith followed him. Neighbors reported hearing shouting, struggling, then a gunshot. By morning, Rigel was dead, his money gone, his wagon and horses disappeared. The B. Odie was hastily buried on the property, beginning what would become standard practice. The execution of her daughter's first husband did nothing to deter Cannon from her chosen path. Instead, it refined her methods and strengthened her resolve to build a more sophisticated criminal organization. The lesson she drew from Brereton's capture wasn't that crime didn't pay. It was that criminals needed better organization and more careful planning to avoid detection. This is how true predators think. They don't see consequences as warnings, they see them as education. When her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, Cannon gained a partner who would prove even more valuable than his predecessor. Johnson wasn't just another kidnapper, he was a businessman who understood the logistics of human trafficking on a regional scale. He had connections throughout the South, experience in transportation and logistics, and most importantly, the capital necessary to expand their operations beyond simple, opportunistic crimes. Johnson brought to the partnership a tavern located precisely on the Delaware-Maryland state line. This establishment, which became known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was positioned so strategically that different rooms literally sat in different states. This geographic advantage allowed them to move kidnapped victims between jurisdictions to confuse pursuing authorities. When Delaware lawmen arrived with warrants, suspects could simply step into the Maryland portions of the building and claim immunity from Delaware jurisdiction. The tavern served multiple crucial functions in their expanding criminal enterprise. It was a legitimate business that provided cover for their activities, generating income and explaining the constant flow of travelers and wagons through the property. It functioned as a holding facility for captives awaiting transport south, with specially constructed hidden rooms and cellars designed to conceal human cargo. And it served as a meeting place for their network of criminals, neutral ground where plans could be made, and profits divided. The physical layout of Johnson's Tavern reflected its multiple dark purposes with architectural precision that would make modern criminals envious. The main floor appeared completely normal, a common room for travelers, a bar area, and rooms for legitimate guests. But beneath the building lay a series of cellars and tunnels that had been specially constructed for hiding kidnapped people. These underground spaces were accessible through concealed entrances and were designed to muffle sound and prevent escape. Iron rings set into stone walls provided anchor points for chains, while small ventilation shafts ensured that captives wouldn't suffocate during long periods of confinement. This wasn't improvised cruelty. This was engineered suffering, planned and executed with the same attention to detail that other businessmen applied to legitimate enterprises. The gang that assembled around Cannon and Johnson was remarkably diverse for its time, and this diversity was strategic brilliance. It included white criminals like Henry Carr, mixed-race decoys such as John Purnell who used multiple aliases, and even enslaved people forced to participate in capturing others. This multiracial composition allowed them to approach victims from every angle. African-American gang members could approach potential victims without immediately raising suspicions, while white members handled negotiations with buyers in the Deep South. John Purnell, described in court records as a yellow man or mulatto, was particularly valuable to the organization. His mixed racial heritage allowed him to move between white and black communities with relative ease. He maintained multiple identities and could present himself as either a free person of color seeking work or a light-skinned white man conducting business, depending on the situation. This chameleon-like ability made him an ideal scout for identifying potential victims and establishing initial contact. Understanding this teaches you something crucial about how predatory systems really work. They don't rely on single methods or approaches. They adapt, they blend, they become whatever they need to be to achieve their goals. As the 1820s progressed, the scope of the Cannon-Johnson operation expanded dramatically, revealing itself to be far more than a local criminal enterprise. Their network stretched from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with documented connections to buyers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. This wasn't just kidnapping, this was industrial-scale human trafficking, a business model that generated enormous profits while destroying countless lives. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia, a Quaker deeply committed to protecting free black Americans, began tracking the disappearances of citizens from his city and tracing them back to the Delmarva Peninsula. Watson's investigations revealed the horrifying scale of the operation and something even more disturbing: the systematic nature of the kidnappings. In 1825 alone, he documented dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon gang. The victims weren't random targets chosen by opportunity, they were specifically selected for their vulnerability and potential value. Young adults brought the highest prices in southern markets, but children were also valuable as they could be trained for specific tasks and would provide decades of labor. The systematic nature of these kidnappings demonstrated a level of organization that went far beyond opportunistic crime. The gang maintained detailed intelligence about potential targets, tracking families and individuals who might be vulnerable to capture. They knew which young people had recently lost jobs, which families were struggling financially, and which individuals might be tempted by offers of employment in distant locations. This is how evil scales itself, not through random violence but through systematic intelligence gathering and strategic targeting. One of the most detailed accounts comes from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman kidnapped in 1825. Her testimony, preserved in court records, describes being held first in Cannon's house, then moved to Johnson's tavern, where she was kept in chains for 5 months. Smith recalled the constant fear, inadequate food, and the knowledge that she was scheduled to be transported south with a large group of other kidnapped people. Smith's account provides crucial details about the conditions endured by victims of the Cannon gang, revealing a level of systematic cruelty that rivals anything in America's darkest history. She described being seized while walking alone on a road near Philadelphia, overpowered by multiple attackers, and transported by wagon to the Delaware-Maryland border. The journey took several days, during which she was kept blindfolded and chained to prevent escape attempts. Upon arrival at the Cannon property, she was placed in a hidden room beneath the main house where she discovered she wasn't alone. The underground holding areas, according to Smith's testimony, contained dozens of other kidnapped people at various times. Men, women, and children were kept in separate areas, all chained to prevent escape. The conditions were deliberately harsh: inadequate food, no sanitation facilities, and constant darkness except when guards brought candles during feeding times. The psychological torture was as brutal as the physical conditions, as captives knew they were destined for sale into lifelong bondage. Smith also provided details about the gang's methods for processing their human cargo that reveal the industrial nature of their operation. Victims were systematically stripped of any documentation proving their free status, and personal belongings that might help identify them were destroyed. They were given new names and false backgrounds that would support their sale as legitimate slaves. Those who resisted or attempted to maintain their true identities were beaten until they complied. This systematic destruction of identity represents something beyond mere criminal activity. It was psychological warfare designed to break the human spirit before sale. The gang's operations were an open secret in the local community, but this reveals something crucial about how evil persists. Neighbors knew that people disappeared near the Cannon property, that wagons arrived at odd hours, and that Johnson's Tavern hosted suspicious meetings. But the victims were Black Americans in a society where their word carried little weight against that of white criminals. Local law enforcement, when it existed at all, showed little interest in investigating crimes against people they viewed as inherently suspicious or undeserving of protection. But the complicity went deeper than mere indifference. Some neighbors actively supported the criminal enterprise, either through direct participation or by providing information about potential victims. Local merchants supplied the gang with provisions, asking no questions about the source of payment. Even some law enforcement officials were suspected of taking bribes to look the other way when suspicious activities were reported. This teaches you something fundamental about how corruption spreads. It's not usually dramatic betrayals, but small compromises that accumulate over time until entire communities become complicit in evil. This indifference changed only when white victims entered the equation, revealing the racial hierarchy that governed justice in early America. The gang didn't just kidnap free Black Americans, they also robbed and murdered slave traders who came through their territory carrying large amounts of cash. These victims were white men engaged in the legal slave trade, and their disappearances attracted the attention that Black victims never received. The first documented case occurred around 1820 when a slave trader from Georgia named Bell or Miller vanished while traveling through the area. This man had been carrying a substantial sum. Some accounts suggest $35,000 intended for purchasing enslaved people. He was last seen at Cannon's establishment, and his horse was later found in her possession. When questioned, Cannon claimed the man had sailed south with a cargo of enslaved people, but investigators found this story implausible. The Georgia trader's disappearance marked the beginning of a pattern that would eventually lead to the gang's downfall. Unlike Black victims whose disappearances generated little official interest, missing white slave traders had business partners and financial backers who demanded investigations. These men carried substantial amounts of money and had planned itineraries that made their disappearances difficult to explain away. Cannon's method for dealing with these white victims was typically brutal, but it revealed her fundamental miscalculation about the consequences of expanding her target profile. The traders would be invited to the tavern under the pretense of conducting legitimate business. Once there, they would be plied with alcohol and encouraged to discuss their financial resources and travel plans. When the opportunity arose, they would be murdered and robbed, their bodies buried on the property, and their money and any enslaved people they were traveling with would be incorporated into the gang's operations. The profits from these murders were substantial. A single slave trader might carry enough money to fund the gang's operations for months, but Cannon was making a critical error that would eventually destroy her entire enterprise. She had operated for so long with impunity against Black victims that she believed herself untouchable. She assumed that the same indifference would protect her when he began murdering white men. This assumption would prove fatal to her criminal empire. By the mid-1820s, pressure was mounting on the Cannon-Johnson gang from multiple directions. Mayor Watson of Philadelphia had begun offering substantial rewards for information leading to arrests, and Governor John Andrew Schulze of Pennsylvania was coordinating with officials in southern states to track kidnapped citizens. Their investigations were revealing not just individual crimes, but a systematic network that had been operating for over a decade. The reward offered by Watson, $500 for information leading to arrests, represented a substantial sum for the period, equivalent to several months' wages for most working people. This financial incentive began to loosen tongues in communities that had previously remained silent about the gang's activities. Former associates, dissatisfied gang members, and even some victims who had managed to escape began providing information to authorities. The gang's response to this pressure was characteristically violent, but it represented a crucial miscalculation. Rather than scaling back their operations, they began eliminating potential witnesses more aggressively. This decision would ultimately prove to be their downfall, as it expanded their list of victims to include people whose disappearances could not be ignored. The escalation in violence during this period reflected Patty Cannon's increasingly paranoid mindset. She had built a criminal empire that generated enormous profits. Estimates suggest the gang's annual income exceeded $50,000. A fortune by early 19th century standards, but this success had made her a target for law enforcement attention, and she became convinced that former associates posed an existential threat to her operations. This paranoia drove her to make the kinds of mistakes that bring down even the most successful criminal enterprises. The most crucial figure in the gang's eventual exposure was a mixed-race boy named Cyrus James, whose story reveals the full horror of how Cannon operated. Cannon had purchased James as a slave when he was only 7 years old and had raised him in her household. As he grew older, James was forced to participate in the gang's activities, serving as a decoy to lure other Black Americans into traps. His intimate knowledge of the gang's operations, combined with his growing revulsion at the violence he witnessed, made him both an invaluable asset and a potential liability. James's position in the Cannon household was unique and tragically complex. As an enslaved child, he had no choice but to participate in whatever activities his owner demanded. But as he matured, he began to understand the full horror of what he was being forced to do, helping to destroy the lives of people who looked like him, people who shared his heritage and vulnerability. This knowledge created an internal conflict that would eventually lead him to cooperate with authorities despite the personal risks involved. The psychological manipulation employed by Cannon to control James was sophisticated and cruel, revealing her understanding of how to break and control the human spirit. She alternated between treating him as a favored member of the household and threatening him with violence or sale to brutal masters in the Deep South. She convinced James that his survival depended entirely on her protection and that any betrayal would result in his immediate death. This combination of dependency and terror kept James loyal for years, even as he witnessed increasingly horrific crimes. But Cannon had underestimated something crucial: the human capacity for moral awakening, even under the most oppressive circumstances. James later testified that he witnessed Cannon murder multiple children on her property, crimes that revealed the depths of her depravity. In one particularly horrific account, he described seeing Cannon take a wounded black child not yet dead from the house in her apron, only for the child to never return. James knew where the bodies were buried because he had been forced to help dispose of them. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated business decisions. The murders James witnessed were not random acts of violence, but calculated decisions based on Cannon's assessment of risk and profit. Children who became sick or injured were killed rather than treated, as medical care would have been expensive and would have attracted unwanted attention. Young people who proved difficult to control or who maintained their insistence on their free status were eliminated as potential sources of trouble. Even infants born to kidnapped women were sometimes killed if Cannon determined they would be more trouble than they were worth. This reveals something crucial about how evil operates at scale. It becomes systematized, bureaucratized, reduced to cold calculations of cost and benefit. The gang's undoing began with their treatment of rival slave traders, as competition in the illegal human trafficking trade was fierce. Cannon's gang had developed a reputation for murdering competitors to steal their money and their human cargo. This practice accelerated as legitimate law enforcement pressure increased. Dead slave traders couldn't testify about their experiences with the gang, but this strategy contained the seeds of their destruction. The decision to escalate violence against white victims reflected both Cannon's growing desperation and her fundamental miscalculation about the consequences of such actions. In early 1829, the bodies began to surface, and with them, the unraveling of Patty Cannon's empire of terror. A tenant farmer working land owned by Cannon was plowing a low-lying area that had recently been cleared when his horse suddenly stumbled into what proved to be a grave. Inside a wooden chest, he discovered humps and bones that authorities determined belonged to the missing Georgia slave trader from nearly a decade earlier. This discovery triggered a systematic search of the property that would uncover multiple burial sites. The farmer who made the initial discovery was working land that Cannon had rented out for additional income. The area had previously been unused because it was prone to flooding, but recent dry weather had made it suitable for cultivation. When the farmer's plough horse suddenly sank into the ground, he initially assumed he had encountered a natural depression or perhaps an old well. It was only when he began digging to free his horse that he realized he had stumbled upon something far more sinister. The wooden chest containing the bones was remarkably well preserved, suggesting it had been buried with care and precision. The chest itself appeared to have been specifically constructed for concealing a body, with dimensions that precisely accommodated a human form. This level of preparation indicated that the burial wasn't a hasty attempt to conceal a crime, but rather part of a systematic approach to body disposal that had been refined over years of practice. This discovery set in motion a chain of events that would finally bring Patty Cannon's criminal empire to an end. Delaware authorities, working with their counterparts in Maryland, obtained search warrants and began a comprehensive investigation of all properties connected to the Cannon-Johnson gang. What they found exceeded their worst expectations and revealed the true scope of the horror that had been operating in plain sight for decades. The investigation was led by Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, working in coordination with Maryland authorities and representatives from the Pennsylvania Governor's Office. This multi-jurisdictional approach was unprecedented for the time period and reflected the growing recognition that the Cannon gang's activities crossed state boundaries and required coordinated law enforcement response. The search warrants obtained by authorities were remarkably broad, allowing them to excavate any areas of the Cannon properties where bodies might be concealed. This legal authority was crucial as it provided protection for investigators who might otherwise have been accused of trespassing or illegal search and seizure. On April 3, 1829, Cyrus James was captured in Delaware. The circumstances of his arrest remain somewhat unclear, but court records suggest he was attempting to flee the region when he was apprehended. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of execution, the young man who had been forced into a life of crime as a child made a fateful decision that would expose the full extent of Cannon's operations. He would cooperate with authorities and reveal everything he knew. The decision to cooperate was not made lightly by James. He understood that his testimony would likely result in his own prosecution for the crimes he had been forced to commit. But he also recognized that continued silence would mean protecting the woman who had enslaved him and forced him to participate in the destruction of countless other lives. His cooperation represented not just a legal strategy, but a moral choice to finally break free from the psychological control that Cannon had maintained over him for years. James's testimony was devastating in its detail and scope. Speaking to Justice of the Peace in Seaford, Delaware, he provided detailed accounts of murders spanning nearly a decade. He told investigators that Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer Johnson, and Patty Cannon had shot the Georgia slave trader while he was eating supper at Cannon's house. He had watched them carry the body to a wooden chest and bury it on the property. But this was just the beginning of his revelations about the systematic nature of Cannon's crimes. The level of detail in James's testimony was extraordinary and provided investigators with their first comprehensive understanding of how the gang operated as a sophisticated criminal enterprise. He was able to describe not just individual crimes, but the systematic methods employed by the gang over many years. He knew the locations of burial sites, the identities of other gang members, the routes used to transport kidnapped people, and the networks of buyers and sellers that stretched across multiple states. This wasn't the testimony of a casual observer. This was the account of someone who had been forced to participate in every aspect of the operation. Following James's directions, authorities began excavating the Cannon property systematically, and each discovery revealed new depths of horror. In a garden area, they found the body of a young mixed-race child. According to James's testimony, this child had been enslaved by Cannon along with his mother. Cannon had killed the child because she suspected the father was white, possibly a member of her own family. The testimony contains no information about the fate of the child's mother, leaving open the horrifying possibility that she too was murdered to eliminate any witnesses to the crime. The discovery of the child's body was particularly disturbing to investigators because it demonstrated the extent of Cannon's callousness and racist paranoia. This wasn't a victim of kidnapping or a rival criminal. This was a child who had been born into Cannon's household and lived under her control. The murder appeared to have been motivated purely by Cannon's fear that a mixed-race child might somehow threaten her operations or expose connections to her family. Additional excavations revealed 2 more wooden boxes, each containing human bones. James identified one set of remains as belonging to another child he had seen Cano and beat to death with a piece of wood. The third set belonged to an adult whom James described as someone they considered had property, meaning the gang believed this person was free and might have resources worth stealing. The systematic nature of these murders painted a picture of Cannon as something beyond a simple criminal. She was a serial killer who had been operating with impunity for years. The physical evidence discovered during the excavations corroborated James's testimony in remarkable detail, validating his credibility and revealing the industrial-scale nature of Cannon's crimes. The wooden boxes used to contain bodies were of similar construction, suggesting they had been specifically manufactured for the purpose of concealing murder victims. The locations of the graves followed a pattern that indicated systematic planning rather than random burial. Most disturbing, the condition of some remains suggested that some victims had been buried while still alive. As news of the discoveries spread, other witnesses began coming forward with accounts that had been suppressed by fear for decades. People who had lived in terror of Cannon for years suddenly found the courage to speak, and their testimonies revealed additional victims and provided details about the gang's methods that corroborated James's account. The dam of silence that had protected Cannon's operations for so long was finally breaking. Among these new witnesses was Thomas Freeman, a free black American who had been approached by gang members in 1827 but had managed to escape. Freeman testified that he had been offered work in Georgia and had been traveling toward the Cannon property when he became suspicious of his escort's behavior. He managed to slip away during a rest stop and spent several days hiding in the woods before making his way back to Philadelphia. Freeman's testimony was significant because it provided insight into the gang's recruitment methods and revealed how close he had come to becoming another victim. The Freeman's account revealed the sophisticated deception employed by the gang in their recruitment efforts. He described how the initial approach had seemed completely legitimate. He had been offered what appeared to be legitimate employment with good wages in a growing region of the country. The escort who was guiding him toward the Cannon property seemed knowledgeable about farming and spoke convincingly about opportunities in Georgia. It was only small details, the route they were taking, the escort's evasive answers to direct questions, and an instinctive sense of danger that alerted Freeman to the trap he was walking into. Additional witnesses came forward with accounts that painted an even more horrifying picture of the scope of Cannon's operations. Former neighbors testified about seeing wagons arriving at odd hours of the night, hearing screams from the direction of the Cannon property, and noticing the sudden appearance of black children and adults who would then disappear just as mysteriously. Local merchants revealed that Cannon had often paid for supplies with unusually large amounts of cash, and had frequently purchased items like chains, locks, and wooden boxes in quantities that seemed excessive for legitimate farm operations. The accumulating evidence revealed that Cannon's criminal enterprise had been far larger and more systematic than even her harshest critics had imagined. Court records suggest that over the course of her criminal career, she may have been responsible for kidnapping hundreds of people and murdering dozens. The financial records that authorities were able to piece together indicated that her operation had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in profits over nearly 2 decades. But the human cost was immeasurable. Families destroyed, children torn from parents, free people sold into lifelong bondage, and countless individuals murdered to protect the secrecy of the operation. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Cannon's operation had been protected by corruption and indifference within the legal system itself. Several local officials were found to have received payments from the gang in exchange for advance warning about investigations or for simply looking the other way when suspicious activities were reported. This corruption had created a protective bubble around Cannon's operations that allowed them to continue far longer than should have been possible. As the full scope of the evidence emerged, it became clear that this case represented more than just the crimes of a single individual or even a criminal gang. It exposed systematic failures in law enforcement, the legal system, and society itself that had allowed such horrors to continue for decades. The indifference to crimes against Black Americans, the corruption of local officials, and the complicity of entire communities in maintaining silence about obvious criminal activity all contributed to enabling Cannon's reign of terror. The legal proceedings against Patty Cannon revealed the challenges of prosecuting such extensive criminal enterprises in the early 19th century American legal system. With evidence spanning multiple states and involving crimes committed over nearly 2 decades, prosecutors faced the complex task of determining which charges to pursue and in which jurisdictions to try them. The multi-state nature of Cannon's operations meant that witnesses were scattered across vast distances. Many victims were dead or had been sold into slavery in unknown locations, and physical evidence had been deliberately concealed or destroyed. Delaware authorities decided to focus on the most recent and best documented murders, particularly those where they had James's eyewitness testimony and physical evidence from the excavations. Cannon was formally charged with 4 counts of murder, though prosecutors made clear that they believed the true number of her victims far exceeded this figure. The decision to limit the charges was strategic. They wanted to ensure convictions on the strongest cases rather than risk acquittals by overwhelming juries with too much evidence. The legal strategy also reflected the racial realities of the justice system at the time. While prosecutors were confident they could secure convictions for the murders of white victims like the Georgia slave trader, they were less certain about getting convictions for the murders of Black victims, even free Black Americans. This harsh calculation demonstrated how even the pursuit of justice was shaped by the racial hierarchies that had enabled Cannon's crimes in the first place. Cannon's response to the charges revealed her continued belief that she could manipulate the system that had protected her for so long. Initially, she attempted to blame her crimes on her male associates, claiming that she had been coerced into participation by threats of violence. When this strategy failed to gain traction, she began claiming that many of her alleged victims were actually still alive and had simply moved to other regions. These claims were easily disproven by the physical evidence, but they revealed Cannon's desperate attempts to avoid accountability. As the legal proceedings continued, more details emerged about the systematic nature of Cannon's operations and the sophisticated methods she had employed to evade detection for so long. Court testimony revealed that she had maintained detailed records of her human trafficking activities, including information about victims, buyers, and financial transactions. These records, discovered hidden in her property, provided prosecutors with a roadmap of her criminal empire and helped them understand the true scale of her operations. The records showed that Cannon had maintained connections with slave DEA leaders throughout the South and had developed sophisticated methods for transporting kidnapped people across state lines without detection. She had established a network of safe houses and transfer points that allowed her to move human cargo efficiently from the Delmarva Peninsula to markets in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. The documentation also revealed that she had been in regular communication with buyers who would place advance orders for specific types of victims: young men for field work, women for domestic service, children who could be trained for specialized tasks. This evidence painted a picture of human trafficking as a systematic business operation rather than opportunistic crime. The testimony of other gang members who were captured provided additional insights into Cannon's methods and personality. Several witnesses described her as the undisputed leader of the operation, someone who made all major decisions and who was feared even by hardened criminals. They testified that she personally participated in murders and that she seemed to derive satisfaction from the suffering of her victims. These accounts contradicted her attempts to portray herself as a victim of circumstance who had been forced into criminal activity by male associates. The trial proceedings were heavily covered by newspapers throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, making Patty Cannon one of the first female serial killers to achieve national notoriety. The coverage revealed widespread public fascination with the case, but also exposed the deep racial prejudices that shaped public understanding of the crimes. Many newspaper accounts focus more on the sensational aspects of a female criminal than on the systematic injustices that had enabled her crimes to continue for so long. The media coverage of the Cannon case reflected and reinforced many of the racial attitudes that had made her crimes possible in the first place. While newspapers expressed outrage about the murders of white victims, their coverage of crimes against black victims was often dismissive or focused on sensational details rather than the human tragedy involved. This differential treatment in media coverage mirrored the differential treatment in the legal system and helped explain why Cannon's crimes against Black Americans had been ignored for so long. As the trial date approached, Cannon's behavior became increasingly erratic, suggesting that the psychological pressure of finally facing accountability was breaking down her carefully maintained facade of control. Guards reported that she alternated between periods of rage and periods of apparent depression. She made several threats against witnesses and attempted to send messages to associates who remained at large, apparently hoping to arrange their silence or escape. On May 11, 1829, before she could be brought to trial, Patty Cannon was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause of death was listed as poison, and authorities concluded that she had committed suicide rather than face execution. Some contemporaries suspected that she had been murdered by associates who feared she might reveal additional details about their criminal network, but no evidence was found to support this theory. Her death ended any possibility of a full accounting of her crimes and left many questions unanswered about the extent of her criminal network. Cannon's death was seen by many as a form of divine justice. She had avoided earthly punishment but could not escape ultimate accountability. However, her suicide also meant that many of her victims' families never received the closure that might have come from a full trial and conviction. The secrets she took to her grave included the identities of additional victims, the locations of other burial sites, and the full extent of her criminal network. Even in death, she managed to protect some of the systems and individuals who had bled her crimes. The investigation into Cannon's operations continued even after her death, as authorities recognized that her criminal network extended far beyond her immediate associates. The broader investigation revealed connections between Cannon's operation and similar criminal enterprises throughout the South and Mid-Atlantic regions. Federal authorities began to understand that they were dealing with not just isolated criminal activities, but a systematic network of human trafficking that had been operating on a national scale. This realization led to enhanced cooperation between state and federal law enforcement agencies and contributed to the development of more sophisticated approaches to investigating multi-jurisdictional crimes. The Cannon case also had significant political implications, as it provided abolitionists with powerful evidence of the horrors that surrounded the institution of slavery. The fact that a criminal enterprise could operate for decades, kidnapping free Black Americans and selling them into bondage, demonstrated the vulnerability of all Black people in a society that legally sanctioned human bondage. Abolitionist publications used the details of Cannon's crimes to argue that the entire system of slavery created conditions that made such horrors inevitable. The case contributed to growing Northern opposition to slavery and helped build support for stronger federal action against human trafficking. However, the political response to the case also revealed the limitations of the justice system in addressing systematic racial oppression. While there was widespread outrage about Cannon's crimes, there was little corresponding effort to address the legal and social conditions that had made those crimes possible. Free Black Americans continued to face legal vulnerabilities that made them targets for kidnappers, and the systems that had enabled Cannon's operations remained largely intact. The aftermath of the Cannon case saw some improvements in law enforcement and coordination and some strengthening of legal protections for free Black Americans, but these changes were limited in scope and effectiveness. The fundamental problems that had enabled Cannon's crimes, racial prejudice, legal discrimination, and systematic indifference to crimes against Black Americans, persisted long after her death. In many ways, the case served as both an exposure of these problems and a demonstration of society's unwillingness to address them comprehensively. The legacy of Patty Cannon's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, shaping legal precedents and law enforcement practices for decades to come. Her case became one of the first major examples of federal cooperation in investigating interstate criminal enterprises, establishing patterns of coordination that would later be formalized in federal law enforcement agencies. The multi-jurisdictional nature of her crimes forced authorities to develop new approaches to evidence sharing and witness protection that would prove valuable in future cases. The investigation also highlighted the importance of protecting witnesses who came forward with information about criminal enterprises. Cyrus James's testimony had been crucial to exposing the full scope of Cannon's operations, but his cooperation had come at great personal risk. His courage in speaking out despite the danger helped establish the precedent that witness cooperation was essential for prosecuting complex criminal cases, but it also demonstrated the need for better witness protection programs. The physical evidence discovered on Cannon's property became some of the most important forensic evidence in early American criminal history. The systematic excavation of burial sites and the careful documentation of remains helped establish standards for crime scene investigation that would influence law enforcement practices throughout the 19th century. The case demonstrated the importance of thorough physical investigation in corroborating witness testimony and building strong criminal cases. The Cannon case also had significant implications for the development of criminal law, particularly in cases involving organized crime and human trafficking. The systematic nature of her operations challenged traditional approaches to criminal prosecution, which had been designed primarily for individual crimes rather than complex criminal enterprises. Prosecutors had to develop new strategies for presenting evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracies and for demonstrating the connections between seemingly separate criminal acts. The legal precedents established in the Cannon case would later prove valuable in prosecuting other organized crime cases throughout American history. The case helped establish that criminal enterprises could be prosecuted as systematic conspiracies rather than collections of individual crimes, making it easier for prosecutors to secure convictions against criminal organizations. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation of Patty Cannon revealed characteristics that would later be recognized as typical of serial killers and leaders of criminal organizations. Her ability to maintain a facade of respectability while conducting systematic violence, her skill at manipulating and controlling subordinates, and her apparent lack of empathy for her victims all became recognized as warning signs of dangerous criminal personalities. The case contributed to early understanding of criminal psychology and the factors that enable individuals to commit systematic violence over extended periods. Cannon's ability to operate undetected for so long also highlighted the importance of community awareness and reporting in preventing criminal activities. Her crimes had been enabled by the silence and indifference of neighbors who suspected criminal activity but failed to report it to authorities. The case demonstrated that criminal enterprises rely not just on the active participation of criminals, but also on the passive complicity of communities that fail to act on their suspicions. The economic aspects of Cannon's operations revealed the powerful financial incentives that drove human trafficking and highlighted the connections between legal and illegal markets in human labor. Her success in generating enormous profits from kidnapping and murder demonstrated that criminal enterprises would continue to exist as long as there were profitable markets for their activities. This understanding would later inform approaches to combating human trafficking by targeting the economic systems that made such crimes profitable. The case also revealed the international dimensions of human trafficking, as some of Cannon's victims were ultimately sold to markets outside the United States. This early recognition of the international scope of human trafficking would later inform federal and international efforts to combat these crimes through coordinated law enforcement action across national boundaries. The documentation of Cannon's criminal network provided valuable intelligence about how human trafficking operations functioned and how they could be disrupted through targeted law enforcement action. The investigation revealed the importance of cutting off financial flows, disrupting transportation networks, and protecting victims who might serve as witnesses in future prosecutions. The impact of Cannon's crimes on the victims and their families extended far beyond the immediate physical harm, creating trauma that affected entire communities for generations. Families who lost members to Cannon's kidnapping operation lived with uncertainty about their loved ones' fates, never knowing whether they were dead or suffering in slavery somewhere in the Deep South. This psychological trauma was compounded by the knowledge that the legal system had failed to protect them and that their communities had remained largely silent about the crimes being committed against them. The case highlighted the inadequacy of support systems for victims of violent crime, particularly victims from marginalized communities. The families of Cannon's victims received little assistance from government agencies or community organizations in dealing with their losses. This lack of support created lasting trauma that affected not just immediate family members but entire communities that lived in fear of becoming targets themselves. The broader African American community in the Delmarva Peninsula and surrounding regions lived with heightened awareness of their vulnerability to kidnapping and violence. The knowledge that Cannon's operation had existed for decades created a pervasive sense of insecurity that affected how people lived their daily lives, where they traveled, and how they interacted with strangers. This psychological impact of systematic criminal targeting would later be recognized as a form of terrorism that affected entire communities, not just direct victims. The case also demonstrated how criminal operations could exploit and exacerbate existing social divisions and prejudices. Cannon's success in operating undetected for so long was due in large part to her ability to exploit racial prejudices that made society indifferent to crimes against Black Americans. Her case showed how criminals could manipulate social attitudes to create protective environments for their activities. The investigation revealed that some of Cannon's victims had been sold to slave owners who were aware that they were purchasing kidnapped free people but who chose to participate in the illegal transactions anyway. This complicity extended the criminal network far beyond the immediate perpetrators and demonstrated how criminal enterprises rely on the participation or acquiescence of supposedly legitimate businesses and individuals. The historical significance of the Patty Cannon case extends beyond its immediate criminal justice implications to its role in exposing the systematic vulnerabilities faced by free Black Americans in the antebellum period. Her crimes provided stark evidence of how legal discrimination and social prejudice created conditions that enabled predatory criminal behavior to flourish unchecked. The case became a powerful indictment not just of individual criminals, but of the social and legal systems that made their crimes possible. Contemporary abolitionists used the details of Cannon's operations to argue that the existence of slavery created conditions that threatened the freedom and safety of all Black Americans, whether enslaved or free. The case provided concrete evidence that the legal protections supposedly afforded to free Black Americans were inadequate and easily circumvented by determined criminals. This argument would later become central to abolitionist rhetoric about the moral and practical problems with maintaining slavery in a society that claimed to value freedom and justice. The case also highlighted the economic incentives that drove human trafficking and demonstrated how legal markets in enslaved labor created demand for illegal kidnapping operations. Cannon's success in selling kidnapped free people into slavery showed that the legal slave market could not effectively distinguish between legitimately enslaved people and kidnapping victims. This problem would persist as long as slavery remained legal and would require the complete abolition of slavery to resolve fully. The documentation of Cannon's criminal network provided valuable insights into how human trafficking operations functioned in the early 19th century and how they adapted to legal and social constraints. Her use of multiple jurisdictions to evade law enforcement, her development of sophisticated transportation networks, and her creation of false documentation for victims all became recognized as standard techniques used by human traffickers. Understanding these methods would later help law enforcement agencies develop more effective strategies for combating similar crimes. The case established important legal precedents about the prosecution of interstate criminal enterprises and demonstrated the need for better coordination between state and federal law enforcement agencies. The challenges faced by prosecutors in the Cannon case would later inform the development of federal laws addressing kidnapping and human trafficking. The psychological manipulation techniques employed by Cannon to control her victims and subordinates revealed sophisticated understanding of how to break down individual resistance and create dependency relationships that facilitated criminal activity. Her methods of controlling Cyrus James and other forced participants in her operation demonstrated how criminal enterprises could exploit vulnerable individuals by alternating between rewards and punishments to create psychological bonds that were difficult to break. These techniques would later be recognized as forms of psychological abuse that were common in human trafficking operations. The case provided early documentation of how criminal organizations use psychological manipulation to maintain control over both victims and subordinates. Cannon's success in maintaining loyalty from subordinates who were aware of her violent tendencies demonstrated the power of psychological control in criminal enterprises. Her ability to inspire fear while also providing economic benefits created complex relationships that made it difficult for subordinates to break away from the organization, even when they became uncomfortable with its activities. The investigation revealed that Cannon had been successful in recruiting participants from multiple racial and ethnic backgrounds, demonstrating how criminal enterprises could exploit social divisions and economic desperation to build diverse criminal networks. Her use of mixed-race individuals like John Purnell as intermediaries showed how criminals could manipulate racial categories and social expectations to advance their illegal activities. The case also highlighted the role of women in criminal enterprises and challenged contemporary assumptions about female participation in violent crime. Cannon's leadership of a large-scale criminal organization and her personal participation in murders contradicted prevailing beliefs about women's supposed inherent moral superiority and their natural reluctance to engage in violence. Her case contributed to more nuanced understanding of how gender roles could both constrain and enable criminal behavior. The evidence suggested that Cannon's gender may have actually provided some protection from suspicion, as neighbors and even law enforcement officials were less likely to suspect a woman of leading a violent criminal enterprise. This gender-based assumption may have contributed to her ability to operate undetected for such an extended period. The international implications of the Cannon case became apparent as investigators traced some of her victims to markets outside the United States, revealing early evidence of transnational human trafficking networks. Some kidnapped individuals were apparently sold to buyers in Caribbean markets or to ships engaged in illegal slave trading that continued despite formal prohibitions. This international dimension highlighted the global nature of human trafficking and the need for international cooperation in combating these crimes. The case contributed to growing awareness among American policymakers about the connections between domestic criminal activity and international criminal networks. The evidence that some of Cannon's operations involved illegal international slave trading helped build support for stronger federal enforcement of prohibitions against the international slave trade and for better coordination with other nations in combating human trafficking. The documentation of Cannon's financial operations revealed the sophisticated money management techniques used by criminal enterprises to hide profits and evade taxation. Her ability to generate and launder large amounts of money demonstrated that criminal organizations required financial expertise to operate successfully over extended periods. This understanding would later inform law enforcement approaches that targeted the financial infrastructure of criminal enterprises rather than focusing solely on direct criminal activities. The case also revealed how criminal enterprises could exploit gaps in financial regulation and oversight to conduct illegal transactions with minimal risk of detection. Cannon's success in moving large amounts of money without attracting official attention demonstrated the need for better financial monitoring and reporting requirements that could help law enforcement agencies track suspicious financial activities. The investigation uncovered evidence that some legitimate businesses had knowingly participated in Cannon's operations by providing services or supplies that facilitated her criminal activities. This business complicity extended the criminal network beyond the immediate perpetrators and demonstrated how criminal enterprises could corrupt legitimate commercial activities. The case highlighted the importance of holding businesses accountable for their participation in criminal activities and established precedents for prosecuting legitimate businesses that knowingly facilitated criminal enterprises. The cover-up that followed Cannon's death reveals how power protects itself even when confronted with undeniable evil. Within weeks of her suicide, certain records began disappearing from court files. Names of prominent citizens who had business dealings with the gang were quietly removed from official documents. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic sanitization of his Tory to protect those who had enabled decades of horror. What you're witnessing here is how the powerful rewrite reality to preserve their positions, even when that means erasing evidence of the most heinous crimes. The local elite who had profited from Cannon's operations, the officials who had taken bribes to look the other way, the merchants who had supplied her enterprise. They all had reasons to ensure that certain truths never saw the light of day. This is your next lesson in understanding how real power operates. It's not just about controlling the present, it's about controlling the narrative of the past. Several prominent families in the region had their names scrubbed from any connection to the Cannon case, despite evidence suggesting they had been aware of her activities. Local historians were discouraged from investigating certain aspects of the case, and some documents were mysteriously lost or destroyed in convenient fires. This pattern of deliberate historical erasure would be repeated countless times throughout American history whenever powerful interests were threatened by uncomfortable truths. The media coverage of Cannon's death also revealed how information could be shaped to serve particular interests. While newspapers provided extensive coverage of her crimes, they paid little attention to the systematic failures that had enabled those crimes to continue for decades. The focus remained on Cannon as an individual monster rather than on the institutional corruption and social indifference that had protected her operations. This selective reporting helped obscure the broader lessons that society needed to learn from the case. Some of the gang members who remained at large were never seriously pursued by law enforcement, suggesting that deals were made to protect certain individuals in exchange for their silence about the full extent of the criminal network. These compromises with criminals demonstrated how the justice system could be manipulated to serve the interests of the powerful rather than the demands of justice. The psychological legacy of the Cannon case extended far beyond the immediate victims to shape how entire communities understood their place in American society. For free Black Americans throughout the region, the case confirmed their worst fears about their vulnerability in a society that claimed to protect their rights while systematically enabling their victimization. The knowledge that such extensive crimes could continue for decades with minimal law enforcement response created lasting trauma that affected generations of families. This psychological terrorism was itself a form of social control, keeping vulnerable populations in a state of constant fear and limiting their ability to fully participate in society. The case demonstrated how criminal violence could serve broader social purposes by reinforcing racial hierarchies and maintaining systems of control. Cannon's crimes weren't just individual acts of violence, they were part of a larger system that used terror to maintain social order and economic exploitation. Understanding this connection between individual criminal activity and systematic social control is crucial to comprehending how power really operates in society. The failure to fully prosecute all those connected to Cannon's operations sent a clear message to other potential criminals that certain types of violence would be tolerated as long as they served the interests of the dominant social order. This implicit permission for violence against marginalized populations would continue to shape American society long after Cannon's death. The case also revealed how criminal enterprises could exploit legal and social loopholes to operate with virtual impunity, provided they targeted the right victims. The pattern of systematic criminal targeting based on race, class, and social vulnerability would be repeated throughout American history in various forms. As from the convict leasing system that followed slavery to modern forms of human trafficking, the techniques pioneered by criminals like Cannon would evolve but never disappear entirely. The legacy of her crimes extends into contemporary issues of criminal justice, human trafficking, and social inequality. The same patterns of systematic victimization, official indifference, and elite protection that characterize the Cannon case can be observed in modern criminal enterprises that exploit vulnerable populations. Understanding this historical continuity is essential for recognizing how these patterns continue to operate in contemporary society and for developing effective strategies to combat them. Now you understand why they don't teach this history in schools. The story of Patty Cannon isn't just about one woman's crimes. It's about how entire systems conspire to enable and protect evil when it serves the interests of power. Every institution that should have stopped her, law enforcement, the courts, the media, even the churches, either actively participated in her crimes or maintained the silence that allowed them to continue. This is the forbidden knowledge they don't want you to possess, that the greatest crimes in history aren't committed by isolated individuals, but by networks of complicity that extend throughout society. For 20 years, Cannon's empire thrived because it served the economic interests of the powerful while targeting those society deemed expendable. The victims were chosen not randomly but strategically. People whose disappearances wouldn't trigger investigations, whose suffering wouldn't generate outrage, whose deaths wouldn't demand justice. This systematic targeting reveals the cold calculation behind what appeared to be random violence. The true horror isn't just in the hundreds of people Cannon kidnapped, the dozens she murdered, or the families she destroyed. The true horror is in the systematic indifference that made her crimes possible and profitable for decades. Every neighbor who heard screams and did nothing, every official who took bribes to look away, every merchant who sold supplies without asking questions, they all bear responsibility for enabling the monster in their midst. But here's what they really don't want you to understand. Patty Cannon wasn't an aberration. She was the logical product of a system that valued some lives over others, that prioritized profit over humanity, that sacrificed justice for convenience. The same systems that enabled her crimes continue to operate today in different forms, targeting different victims, but following the same patterns of systematic exploitation and official indifference. If you found this revelation disturbing, if it changed how you see the systems around you, then comment, eyes open below. Comment it twice if you're ready to see more forbidden history that they've hidden from you, because once you understand how deeply these patterns run through American history, you can never go back to believing the comfortable lies they've been telling you. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you imagine, and the truth about how power really operates will transform everything you think you know about the world around you. Subscribe for more forbidden knowledge that they don't want you to possess.